Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm meteorologist Mike Ottenweller, and you have tuned into your Alaska weather, brought to you by the National Weather Service. Tonight is January 30th, 2018. Happy Tuesday to you all. As always, you can get in touch with us, 1-800-472-0391, and that'll get you connected to any of the three offices, the Juneau, Fairbanks, or Anchorage office through the automated system. Weather.gov/Alaska, and that's how you can see, again, all three offices across the state. And if you need to get in touch with us here at the TV desk, nws.ar.tvweather at noaa.gov, and Mr. Dave Snider or one of us will get back with you as soon as possible. So let's jump right in tonight. We got some fun stuff to talk about. Let's first start off with our advisory, and here it is, the only winter weather hazard that we have across the state. Winter weather advisory for wind chills up along the Klondike Highway near White Pass. This is in effect until 12 p.m. on Wednesday, and it is for wind chills nearing 35 degrees below zero. So if you are traveling through that region, please be prepared. Have the proper travel equipment and extra blankets and whatnot to stay safe in case you do have to stop in those areas. Very cold wind chills persist, and those will continue until 12 p.m. Wednesday. So now this is our fun stuff that we have to talk about. Let me step over here so you can see what we expect for much of the state to be able to see with these clear skies that we've been experiencing is our lunar eclipse that we're going to see tonight, our total lunar eclipse at perigee. And so with this, what we're expecting is, or what we'll see happen is the moon will move into the shadow of the Earth. And with that, we'll see a partial penumbra will start to partially eclipse the moon, and then as it moves into the umbra region, it will fully eclipse it back out into the partial eclipse later on. So that's basically going to look like what the moon would look like at a sunrise or sunset time, and that it will turn that darkish hue of red. And here it is, if you are interested in going out tonight, here's the timelines for those in much of Alaska. A slight variation at times, but for the most part, it will start just before 3 a.m. It will, total eclipse will begin at 3:51 a.m. It will peak at 4:30 a.m. and then 5:08 it will move back into the penumbra, and then by 6:12 a.m. it will be over. So an early morning for those that are interested in stargazing and watching this, but it will be quite the sight to see. And here it is in motion. Again, let me slide out of your way so you can see what it looks like. There's the partial eclipse as it moves through the penumbra, then into the umbra for the total eclipse. And that's where that deep hue of red will take place. Pretty cool. Some may call it a blood moon. And then back out here and back into the penumbra before it finally passes back into to the regular phase. So pretty cool event tonight, and we'll have mostly clear skies. As you can see here, a little tough to see with the colder temperatures, but much of the state from basically Fairbanks southward through south central, even good portions of southeast Alaska are clear. Really the only clouds are in association with this area of low pressure spinning here in the Gulf, helping to wrap some moisture back in towards the Copper River Basin. And then there are some clouds backing up against the Brooks Range from the northeast. Clear skies dominate under this strong ridge of high pressure that has really been taking shape over the last week, maybe even 10 days now. And let's look at this again here. You can see that moisture wrapping around one low towards Ketchikan, and then our dominant feature that we'll see for the next couple days here in the central portion of the Gulf is this area of low pressure at 1,998 millibars. Excuse me, 998 millibars, not 1,000. And with that, we have our boundary that's basically representing the cold air coming offshore and the warm air that is still out over the open waters. And so with that, just a little bit of snow showers lingering along the coastline, but that quickly becomes a rain-snow mix, and then all rain as it tracks in the form of showers into southeast Alaska. For you in southeast there, we see some snow wrapping around there near that area of low pressure, some snow reported just south of Juneau, and that's where also we can expect those wind chills as that colder air wraps in behind this, those tighter isobars packed in there. And so with that, you can expect those wind chills until about 12 noon tomorrow, minus 35 degrees. As we look towards the eastern portion of the state, you can see that's where we have the light snow showers continuing up along the Brooks Range and some light snow showers towards the Copper River Basin. But once you get west of those areas, it's really clear skies. Hard to tell on this map because of those cold temperatures interfering with the satellite, but really clear skies throughout much of the state. Not until you move that cold air offshore into the Aleutians and the Bering do we see some more snow showers starting to blow up there along the chain. We also want to mention the blowing snow because of these gusty offshore winds, blowing snow along both the Alaska Range and a little bit more prevalent there along the Brooks Range. How about into tonight? Well, not going to be a whole lot of change in this pattern. This high pressure at 1,043, this one is at 1,000, is very stagnant and very strong, and that's what's helping to wrap cold air all the way around from Siberia back down into the mainland. So you can see blowing snow will continue for the higher mountain ranges, and that offshore flow keeping things quite clear across much of south and western Alaska. Should still see clear skies tonight for much of south central. Just a few clouds. This probably looks more ominous than it needs be, but probably just a few clouds working their way back in around this area of low pressure for much of the Kenai Peninsula and the Cook Inlet region. Some snow wrapping in towards Kodiak and possibly into Seward. And then as we get off towards southeast Alaska, we'll see that snow move off inland and just some light rain and snow showers as you get down towards the Dixon Entrance region tonight. Again, not a whole lot of change, pretty slow moving pattern. This boundary starts to drift just a little bit further south on Wednesday, so we can see that snow line drift just a little bit farther away from the coast, still bringing some light snow to Kodiak Island, wrapping around this 1,003 millibar low. And then as we look towards the mainland, we still see that blowing snow hanging in there along the Alaska Range, down towards the Kuskokwim Mountains. A new area of some light snow starting to track along the Arctic coastline there, courtesy of a stronger low, but it will stay well north of the state. And then again, with that cold offshore flow, once it mixes in with the warmer waters out here and comes up the backside of the ridge, you can start to see some more rain and snow showers developing out that direction. As we then get into Thursday, you can see that one area of light snow starting to make its way a little bit further south into the into the Brooks Range and starting to spread out along the Chukchi coastline there, the Beaufort Sea coastline. As we look down towards the towards the Gulf of Alaska, some light snow showers continuing here along the northern Gulf Coast and into Kodiak Island. This boundary continues to slide ever slowly away from the state. Colder air really settling in as warm air tries to combat it. This is really what we're going to be keying in on as we go forward into the next week or so, is how much warm air can finally surge north. New warm front here stretching into southeast Alaska, and we do expect that to bring some rain towards the Dixon Entrance by the end of Thursday, but it's going to be slow progression as this cold air is strongly entrenched under high pressure. So what do our temperatures look like? Well, you can see here this cold air mass will remain in place. Temperatures hovering near -30 for the coldest spots there just north of the Yukon, and otherwise temperatures dropping into the single digits across much of southern Alaska. We'll see temperatures generally in the teens to upper 20s as you get towards the open, warmer waters of southeast Alaska. Towards the west coast, generally single digits to just below zero, and then off towards the Alaska Peninsula, temperatures generally in the 20s. For tomorrow's highs, well, they're going to be fairly similar to today, where we see some sunshine try to make a difference. Low 20s across south central. We'll see temperatures just in the mid-range below zero, in the mid-teens below zero for much of central and interior Alaska, and then trying to climb up towards the teens along the west coast. It'll be right around 30 degrees for southeast Alaska. For Thursday morning's lows, you can expect temperatures right around 30 degrees towards the open waters, but they're going to be a little bit colder there towards White Pass, 7 degrees up near the higher elevations. And then again, generally in the -30 degree range, and maybe even some -35 degrees in spots over the interior, with single digits dominating along the west coast. Towards southern Alaska and out towards the Alaska Peninsula, climbing from the single digits up towards 25 degrees. And how about for high temperatures on Thursday? Well, not going to be a ton of change. Temperature generally expected between 20 and 35 degrees for much of southeast Alaska, except again towards White Pass and Skagway there near 15. And then generally about 20 degrees below zero for much of the interior, and temperatures pretty similar to Wednesday for much of the Alaska Peninsula.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Let's take a look at your flying weather now, and as you can see here for Wednesday morning, our IFR conditions are still hovering right around that area of low pressure that continues to spin across the Gulf, throwing some of that IFR into southeast Alaska too, mainly for the higher elevations, and otherwise surrounded by a wider swath of MVFR across the northern Gulf and up into the higher elevations of southeast Alaska. Still seeing some of that energy rotating around that ridge, and so we do have some MVFR and IFR conditions just here in the eastern quadrant of the Copper River Basin, and then again up along the coastline here as we see some moisture make it over top of that ridge and back up against the Brooks Range. IFR conditions up there along the Arctic coastline and north of the Brooks Range, stretching down just southeast of the Brooks Range into the Yukon River Valley. Out towards the Bering, you do still have a wide swath of MVFR conditions out there with some IFR conditions embedded in there as moisture rides up the western side of the ridge. As we get into the day on Wednesday, a little bit of improvement out there with those IFR conditions diminishing to just MVFR. We see things improving up along the Arctic coastline as well, with IFR conditions well off the coastline now and just MVFR hugging the coast there. And then as we get over towards the Copper River Basin, our area has become a little bit smaller. Still expect the Mentasta Pass to be slightly obscured there with MVFR conditions. Otherwise, MVFR conditions stretching from southeast Alaska through Kodiak Island and into the eastern portion of the Alaska Peninsula. With that, we do have that swath of IFR conditions with that northeasterly flow into Kodiak Island. For Thursday now, our MVFR and IFR conditions, similar location, stretch out here from southeast Alaska all the way through Kodiak Island and then down into the eastern and central Aleutians. Our area up near the Copper River Basin is getting ever so much smaller as we see it shrinking there as that moisture starts to diminish. And then up along the Arctic coastline, one more shot of MVFR conditions there, pushing up against the Brooks Range with IFR conditions over the northeastern portion of the state. And then into Thursday afternoon, improving conditions once again along the Arctic coastline with just a small pocket of IFR along the Brooks Range. As we look down towards the Gulf, that MVFR area has slid a little bit further south, so down towards the Dixon entrance now, all the way towards Kodiak Island. IFR there for Kodiak City with that northeast flow, and then MVFR across the chain for the Aleutians. How about our passes? Well, you're going to see a similar trend here with that dry offshore flow. That Adigan and Anitukvik Pass are going to both be VFR. Lake Clark and Mariel will be visual flight rules. Rainy, same story. With dry offshore flow, we can expect most of our passes to see VFR conditions. It's only where we see some of that moisture sneaking in that we do have momentary MVFR through the morning hours, but improving there at Isabel. Mentasta should be our area of most concern with marginal visual flight rules through the day. Tanita, VFR. Portage also is going to be VFR, and Chilkoot and White last passes will be VFR as well. How about our freezing levels? Well, no surprise to anyone who's been in Alaska for any time. Late January, you can expect that surface line to be well south of the state and mainly cold air pooled across the whole state. Not until you get well off to the western portion of the Bering do we see any rise in those freezing levels, or well south of southeast Alaska down here, 2,000 feet as you get towards the Queen Charlotte Islands. Then as we get into our icing, not a whole lot of icing to speak of, just around that area of low pressure, some isolated moderate above 2,000 feet from southeast Alaska up into portions of south central, mainly going to be hugging along the coast down into Kodiak Island. Another small area with that moisture associated up along the Arctic coastline above 2,000 feet. How about our jet stream? Well, pretty rigorous south of the area, but not really a whole lot to speak of across our area as far as speeds. 170 knots coming around this low, and then it turns in a major way up meridionally over this high, coming down through the state at about 60 knots, so not the upper level support that we saw bring those winds yesterday through much of the Matanuska River Valley, but still 60 knots, helping to push that flow offshore, and then it turns sharply back from west to east at 150 knots into the lower 48. So how does that look like at 9,000 feet? Well, similar story there with that offshore flow continuing all the way between 60 and 50 knots at 9,000 feet. Fairly strong northeasterly flow moving offshore, and that's really the big story. Similar story across the Gulf with south to north, then sharply turning to an easterly flow. So here's our area where a lot of the winds are going to converge. Possibility of some turbulence here. And again, that strong offshore flow has really been the feature in this pattern. Similar story at 3,000 feet, just a little bit less speeds, anywhere between 30 and 45 knots. Coming across the Canadian area and out into the North Pacific at about 45 knots northeast to southwest, and then south to north becoming east to west at about 30 knots here over southeast Alaska. So the result will be a fairly widespread area of considerable moderate turbulence where that flow is interacting with terrain below 4,000 feet for southeast Alaska and below 6,000 feet for south central Alaska. That strong offshore flow kind of pushing through those gaps and helping that cold air to really blast through, and that's what results in those turbulence. Stay tuned, we'll be back with your marine forecast.
Technology. It's the rhythm of our everyday life. We're more dependent on satellite and communication systems than at any other time in history. Disruptions can affect our economy and even our safety. To prepare for the effects of such events and minimize impacts, we need to look outside our atmosphere, some 93 million miles away, at a star we call the Sun. It's our main energy source. It warms the Earth and grows our food. While the Sun and the space between may seem pleasant from our perspective, it's anything but peaceful. At its surface exists a chaotic state of eruptions and radiation. And unlike Vegas, what happens at the sun doesn't stay at the sun.
Space weather is essentially emissions from the sun, radiation, magnetic field that erupts from the solar surface, pumped out into space, sometimes right towards Earth. When it impacts the Earth, it impacts our technology. That's what we call space weather.
These solar events and their effects at Earth can disrupt systems we take for granted. From causing blackouts to the power grid, to delaying offshore drilling operations due to inaccurate GPS data. Interference with communication systems can force air traffic to reroute and impact rescue response and coordination. Outside our atmosphere, solar radiation can harm astronauts and the systems they depend on. The good news is that these eruptions can be detected early. Forecasters at the NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado, have their eyes on the sun at all times.
The Space Weather Prediction Center is part of the National Weather Service and is very much like a normal weather forecast office. We're here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We're looking at data, we're looking at imagery, we're looking at model outputs. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches of imminent activity to our customers so they can take action.
In many ways, forecasting space weather is a lot like forecasting hurricanes. Those who rely on space weather forecasts, like electric power grid managers, are informed early on and can begin taking protective action.
When we see an eruption on the sun, space weather forecasters will issue a watch. And this is much like a hurricane watch. When a hurricane sits offshore of Miami, for example, perhaps 48 hours out, we too can see way in advance that something may be coming towards the Earth.
As the storm moves toward us, it hits a monitoring spacecraft orbiting 1 million miles away from Earth.
It's kind of our buoy sitting out there offshore, and that hurricane about 30, 45 minutes before it makes landfall, we'll get the measurements from the buoy. That's what the spacecraft does for us. That big eruption that left the sun hits the spacecraft. Now we've got the measurements of exactly what's going to impact us here on Earth, and we issue the warnings to give the power grid a heads up that the storm is now imminent. An interesting element to this whole process is that when the forecasters issue the alert, the power grid receives the alert, takes the necessary actions to protect the grid, and the average citizen never knows anything ever happened.
The number of customers who rely on space weather information continues to grow. As our reliance on technology increases, so will our need for constant monitoring of the sun.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
GPS has changed society. Most people don't realize how remarkable and how many different applications there are.
The GPS has become an integral part, not just of our daily lives as far as cell phones and guidance for our cars and mapping, but the whole system in agriculture is really relying heavily on high accuracy GPS.
So they're using GPS to plant those seeds with centimeter accuracy. And then they can come behind it and irrigate and fertilize right where that seed is with that 1 centimeter accuracy.
The GPS creates a line for the operator that he can steer along, or you go to another level and the operator doesn't steer anymore and the tractor has an automatic steering system on it, much like a cruise control on a car, except for when I push the button it doesn't drive a set speed. When I push a button it stays on a predefined line.
You don't even need lights. You can do it at nighttime. You program your GPS and it's driving that tractor for you. So it's huge, and it's changing the way that the farmers farm the fields.
6 or 7 days out.
There's an interest in GPS applications from space weather side because when the sun is eruptive, it causes GPS to falter, and in some cases it doesn't work at all.
Productivity may suffer to a certain degree in that there's no way that I as a human being can steer as good 8 hours a day as a GPS system's going to do. It's going to be the same all day long. Some of the other application technologies, those are going to be gone. We're not going to have the ability to do good section control on sprayers and planters and fertilizer applicators without GPS.
We see a huge growing customer base in so many different industries, so many different sectors now relying on GPS and high precision GPS. They're all big customers for us.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Now it's time for your marine forecast, and we'll start off with our sea ice analysis from today. And you can see here the sea ice and the pack ice continue to grow along the west coast all the way down through Bristol Bay and the north side of the Alaska Peninsula. Still some marginal ice out there near St. Lawrence Island, so if you are trying to travel through this region, just be advised that there is some marginal ice still trying to fill in. But these cold temperatures are helping the ice to grow, bringing that offshore wind through the area, helping the ice to continue to grow. Even across Cook Inlet, starting to see a little bit more growth. As we get into our southeast marine forecast, you can see up towards Lynn Canal, those offshore winds are making their presence known even in the Marines. North winds at 45 knots and seas about 9 feet. Down towards Stevens Passage, you can see north winds 35 knots all the way up to gusts of 50 though, and seas about 7 feet. And then down towards Clarence Strait, expect southeast winds 15 knots, seas about 5 feet. As we get towards the outer waters, you can expect mainly east and a little bit more subtly towards the southern portions, but easterly winds throughout about 20 to 40 knots, strongest near the offshore areas near Yakutat, and seas between 8 and 9 feet. On to Thursday, expect those strong northerly winds to continue for Lynn Canal down through Stevens Passage, 40 knots with some gusts of 50, seas 7 to 8 feet, and then more of an easterly flow down towards Clarence Strait, seas about 4 feet with 20 knots. Out towards the open waters, generally going to see an easterly wind 25 to 35 knots, and seas are going to be between 7 and 9 feet. For the south central portion on Wednesday, you can expect a northeast wind throughout the entire area with offshore flow. And as that happens, you can expect the seas to climb once we move away from the protected waters and out towards the open waters there. So 13 feet down by the Barren Islands with about 35 to 40 knots down there towards the southern end of the Kenai Peninsula. Otherwise, about 25 knots in Cook Inlet and Prince William Sound on Wednesday. Things calming down a little bit on Thursday, 10 to 30 knots across the area, and seas in the protected areas, 3 feet, climbing all the way up to 7 to 12 feet near the southern tip of the Kenai. On into southwest and Bristol Bay area for Wednesday, you can see that generally offshore flow through this area as well, keeping things northeast and northerly anywhere from 25 to 40 knots, and seas running about 11 feet through Shelikof, a little bit lighter outside, 7 to 9 feet south of the Alaska Peninsula, and then 6 to 11 feet north of the peninsula. On into Thursday, we'll expect generally a northeast wind, 25 to 35 knots, and seas are going to be running between about 6 to 9 feet north of the peninsula and anywhere between 10 and 12 feet as you get just south of Kodiak Island and through Shelikof Strait. How about for the Aleutian chain? Well, that northeast flow will push all the way across the Bering. As it does so, you can expect the seas to build as that wind has a longer chance to work on the water, and we call that the fetch. The longer the winds work from the same direction, the higher the waves usually are, especially the wind waves, and so anywhere between 8 all the way up to 13 feet across this area. Northeast winds dominate between 25 and 30 knots. On into Thursday now, you can see northeast winds continue to dominate 30 knots, and now the seas have risen all the way up to 15 feet. For the west coast on Wednesday, northeast and northerly winds along the ice pack here about 10 to 25 knots. A little bit stronger off the pack, about 20 to 30 knots, and seas climbing from 6 up to 11 feet down by the Pribilofs. And similar story there on Thursday, northeast winds throughout the region, 15 to 30 knots, and seas generally climbing from 6 to 12 feet as the fetch increases down by the Pribilof Islands. How about for the Arctic coast? Well, you can see on Wednesday here kind of a little bit more variable offshore winds, about 10 knots, fairly light, becoming south and southwest, eventually westerly 10 knots over towards Kaktovik and ice cap throughout this area. And then on Thursday along the Arctic coast, northeast winds becoming northerly down towards the Seward Peninsula and 10 to 20 knots there. Otherwise, expecting fairly light winds out of the north and west, 5 to 10 knots along the Beaufort Sea coast. So let's recap the weather, and you can see here our area of low pressure that's being created by that gusty offshore cold air helping to spin this low up in the Gulf, and with that it tries to work some precipitation back along the Gulf Coast, maybe even a little bit of light snow in the Copper River Basin. Do still have some light snow being reported northeast of, or being expected northeast of the Brooks Range, and some blowing snow along the Alaska Range and the Brooks Range, with just some rain showers moving in southeast of southeast Alaska. As we get into Wednesday, this boundary starts to drop a little bit further away from the coastline, so we do still expect some light snow to try to wrap in towards the southern Kenai and Kodiak areas, but again, a high pressure bringing offshore flow through the area is really the major story. And then as we get into Thursday, that area starts to slip even further south, but we do start to see this area of warm air start to try to push its way north. That's going to be the battle as we go towards the end of the week. Be advised for those traveling near White Pass, there's wind chill advisory remains in effect. Enjoy the eclipse tonight. Have a great night.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.